I'm one of those self-condemning people. I always tend to look at all the things I do wrong and ignore any kind of praise, but that's just my character.
You're the man, Pete!
Yeah. Wow, I really appreciate everybody being here. It's a great little crowd and a nice little space. I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought I'd walk into some barrage of billboards and insanity that is, the media depiction of Occupy Wall Street and everything else. Instead, I see a great deal of sanity and calm and balance, which I expected actually to begin with. I'm joking. But basically, we've already jumped in 10 minutes into this. This lecture is about 40 minutes, and we want to have as much time as possible, which is really the point of these town halls, as we call it in the Zeitgeist movement, for Q&As, which will go around to as many people as possible for as long as we can in this space to engage questions and answers, not just from myself, but other people in the movement that have come here from different places, our representative coordinators, etc. As I will talk about in this presentation, there's a collective group element of thought that's critically important that we tend to forget about, which I am just a manifestation of. So let's begin. As you all know, my name is Peter Joseph, and the title of this lecture, which I notice everyone's kind of pointing towards me, at least here, but hopefully you can see the screen, those that are back there, because the visual aids are somewhat helpful, although they're not really that defining. But the title is Understanding Root Causes, Following the Train of Thought to a New Social System. As I developed this talk, I basically ended up focusing a lot more on the problems than I intended to, and less about a long-winded description of what the new social model will be, even though I touch upon it. What I ended up doing with this is taking all of the ideas that Occupy Wall Street and many other uprisings around the world are concerned with, the problems, and try my best to show how they all break down to the same basic common denominator. Before I begin though, I want to talk about the nature of information itself and the way we think about it. We live in a society that tends to judge the messenger of information. You ever notice that? Rather than actually taking the data in on its own merit. If I was to hand you a piece of paper with a series of ideas on it, would you take those ideas on their own merit, or would you need to know who wrote that piece of paper to decide whether you agreed with it or not? This tendency is based on the assumption that we as individuals actually serve as sources for any ideas we have, that we are truly original in anything that we talk about or communicate, and that who we are as defined by culture is somehow means anything when it comes to the nature of information and knowledge itself. The key word here is causality, if anyone walks away with anything in here. The kind of the fatal flaw, if you will, of our psychology, broadly speaking, is that we always think about the origin of things as though there's such a reality, when in fact we can find no real beginning or end when it comes to anything related to knowledge, discovery, invention, or thought itself. Everything just feeds into itself. Human beings on this level are basically vehicles. Our brains absorb existing information, combine the data based on our intellectual filters, which are largely programmed by culture, and then re-output them again into the environment for others to absorb, process, output, and on it goes. Knowledge seems to evolve, just like biology, processed through what I called earlier the group mind, if you will. And our social communication and hence education is what keeps the evolution of knowledge going, continuing, never stopping. As I said before in other lectures, if you study the biology of the human brain, it hasn't changed that much in thousands and thousands of years, yet we have extremely different behaviors and continue to have extremely different behaviors as cultural evolution moves on, or the evolution of the group mind, or the evolution of the organism of knowledge itself, if you will. Therefore, judging the message, judging the communicator, as opposed to the message makes absolutely no sense. The only judgment that can possibly exist is with respect to the information itself and how it holds up against a benchmark of critical analysis. Hope that's clear. So if you don't agree with something that I have to say, you're not actually disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with the information itself. And that might sound like a trivial point to somebody, like, why does it even matter? Why is he talking about this? But if you understand how each of us represent part of this group mind, with all of us responsible for what's going on in the collective awareness, it will completely change the way you think about communication and ideas themselves dramatically. And you will stop pointing fingers, you will stop projecting responsibility in your surroundings, and you'll begin to recognize how human actions and ideas are actually never causal to any specific source. It's actually causal to all of us, as complicated and convoluted as that might sound. But give that some thought. Now, I've broken this event into 3 sections. We're going to talk about sourcing problems, the problems as it were. I say sourcing problems because until we find the root or close to the root of any given problem, we're not going to accomplish anything. And as many here who are familiar with the Zeitgeist movement may know, obviously I'm going to bring most of these down to how the flawed socioeconomic system is basically generating these problems through, again, the processing of our group mind awareness, where we all become extensions of this flaw in our behavior and perceptions. Then in section 2, I'm going to talk about a new train of thought, very briefly, which will be a quick ground-up logical consideration with respect to what we've learned about ourselves, as science has moved forward, how we can, quote, correctly live in the world we do. I say correctly, what does that mean? It means how we actually properly align with nature itself, since there's really no point in us imposing anything that we think upon the world we exist in. We can only extract our knowledge and values from it. It's a process of listening, not controlling. And then at the end, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have the Q&A, which hopefully we'll have at least an hour and a half for. All right, part 1, sourcing problems. Anyone staying up to date with modern sociological study knows that the majority of things that our culture values come from the environment. We value things that basically originate in our environment. The classic example, of course, is religion. If you're born into a religious community, odds are you will have those values or close to it. If you were born as an Aztec 600 years ago and were exposed to nothing else, you might very well find human sacrifice to be a rewarding spiritual tradition, as it was. While those in the exact same period living in Europe would have been horrified by such advents. Values and morality appear to be quite relative when you view them from the perspective of history. But if our worldviews come from cultural influence, how did the cultural institution itself come to be? It's sort of a chicken and egg type thing. So if we're influenced by culture and groomed by it, how did that culture initially that created you come into being? And I very often get the question, well, is it our human nature? This is a very common one. Is our human nature that's created this? So this must be human nature if this is the way things are. We had to manifest this ourselves, and therefore the assumption is it must be empirical. And of course, there's plenty of evidence to show that that's not the case. But I'm going to focus on basically one. And I think Jiddu Krishnamurti, a great philosopher, stated this best. The crisis is a crisis of consciousness, a crisis that cannot anymore accept the old norms, the old patterns, the ancient traditions. And considering what the world is now, with all the misery, conflict, destructive brutality, aggression, and so on, man is still as he was. He's still brutal, violent, aggressive, acquisitive, competitive, and he has built a society along those lines. What is underscoring that quote is that the crisis today is a conflict between old, static, traditional worldviews and their prevailing institutions, and the ever-emergent, exponentially changing now, evolution of knowledge and awareness, which, given enough time, will continually alter and override everything we think is true and right today. The rate of change in human society a long time ago was extremely slow compared to what's happening today. The fundamental factor of social change, which is information and physical technology, hence knowledge and tools, is now increasing exponentially. It's out of our control now. And the effects of that change are not only making obsolete many of our institutions that have, again, appeared relevant for very long periods of time and almost permanent in the past, but are also bringing to the surface unreconcilable problems that simply went unnoticed before. Very simply, as I will explain as we go, every dominant governing institution today, from politics to economics to general philosophy, has severely outdated, detrimental flaws built into them. And the more they remain in the wake of our new understandings and abilities, the more they will self-destruct around us and affect us quite negatively, causing increased suffering. This isn't to say that prior institutions didn't fulfill a needed purpose at the time. They certainly did, as pointed out earlier, but we're holding on to them blindly as though they are still relevant and applicable, when in fact they are not. This is really a foundational psychological problem that we're facing. Traditional institutions clashing with our ever-emergent understanding of reality. Now, here are a list of 6 social problem categories. Wealth imbalance, class, absolute relative poverty, war, self-explanatory, public health, such as living standards or safety, cancer rates, disease, labor, unemployment, exploitation, the financial system, debt, design issues, and habitat and resource mismanagement, such as pollution and depletion. All of these issues are quite common to the Occupy movement, which is why I've kind of honed in on them as I have, considering the climate around us. So let's start with wealth imbalance. We all know the stats at this point. 1% of the world owns 40% of the planet's wealth. 400 Americans have more wealth than 150 million combined. 50% of Americans only own 2.5% of America's wealth, which I thought was a different statistic that you don't hear, but equally as amazing when you think about it. As far as abject global poverty, the World Health Organization claimed a little while back that poverty had decreased, showing progress, as it were. But their measure was completely faulty if you actually dug into their statistics. And while it's true that the number of people living on less than $1 a day has indeed decreased slightly, the number of people living on less than $2 a day, which is still way beyond poor, has substantially increased. Today, almost half of the world, 3 billion people, live on less than $2 a day. And 1 out of every 2 children are impoverished in the world, while in wealthy America, over 21% of children are actually below the poverty line. Such depressing stats can go on, and if you follow the trends of this, anybody that has children or plan to, a very ominous future ahead of you, if you actually follow what's happening in the world with respect to the wealth imbalance. To summarize it in a brutal statistic, someone starves to death every 3.6 seconds on this planet. That's a dramatic thing to be empathetic to. It's almost like the old Gandhi quote, poverty is the most severe form of violence, to paraphrase, and is absolutely right. Now, why is all of this? Well, let's ask 2 questions here. What are the factors that contribute to poverty and deprivation, which are built into the same concept? And does the existence of poverty and deprivation actually serve a beneficial role with respect to our current economic model? There's a question you don't hear very often. The common myth around poverty is that there's not enough food, or there's too many people on Earth, or we just simply don't have enough production efficiency to meet the needs of the human population. All dead wrong. We have ever-increasing production efficiency, and even with the old methods of production, not to mention the amazing new methods we have on the sidelines, which are not being utilized because they're simply too efficient for the market system to absorb at this time. We already produce more calories than are needed for the entire world population, way exceeding the population, in fact. Not to mention, again, if you combine the inefficiencies the efficiencies in production we're currently not applying as applied earlier if you study work like the Venus Project or Buckminster Fuller, there are tremendous potentials out there that are not even remotely tapped. So the problem is not technical, it's clearly economic. It has to do with money. And while poverty organizations continue to point out various effects that create poverty, such as commodity prices, national debts, economic decline, healthcare costs, job loss, and the like, rarely are the very mechanisms of the economic system brought into question. Now I'm going to jump to the end and work backwards here. The only thing that will stop poverty and similar deprivation on this planet is a complete removal of the entire monetary market model of economics as it exists. Why? Because not only does this system generate poverty and the growing wealth divide by its inherent mechanisms and internal reinforced logic, the psychology, it actually gains advantage from that deprivation in order to perpetuate itself. The system needs deprivation, in other words, to work. Let me ask you all, who were the laborers in the earliest market exchange models? Anybody? Slaves, good. Slaves, in the view of the market, means the ability to reduce costs for the producer. In modern terminology, it's called cost efficiency. In order for competing producers to gain profit, they must cut their costs by whatever means they can. And you know the old misleading capitalist catchphrase, to produce the best possible goods at the lowest possible prices. Translated, that means we will cut whatever material and labor costs we can to produce an inferior product that is just acceptable and affordable enough for the consumer to purchase. When you see sweatshop slavery in the world today, you are seeing the free market logic and its cost efficiency mechanism at its finest. When you see illegal immigrants being exploited for labor at half of minimum wage, you are seeing the free market system at its finest and its highest level of efficiency. When you witness the sea of debt slaves roaming around the West, trapped in low-paying jobs without health insurance or any social support, almost like they're indentured servants to the bank's debt and interest, you are seeing the logic of the market model at its finest. And the consequence of all that needed scarcity, forcing people into positions that can be exploited, is why we have the absolute and relative poverty and hence deprivation we see in the world today in the broad scheme. The system would not be able to operate if any kind of basic balance in human needs were met, or any decent level of living standard. Scarcity is required to increase this cost efficiency mechanism. In the words of economist and anthropologist Marshall Salins, the market industrial system institutes scarcity in a manner completely unparalleled and to a degree nowhere else approximated, where production and distribution are arranged through the behavior of prices, and all livelihoods depend on getting and spending. Insufficiency of material means becomes the explicit, calculable starting point of all economic activity. And while many talk about, in various movements, the removal of debt, the removal of interest, and the firm legislation to outlaw slave labor, create high fixed minimum wages for the world's people to get their needs met, they do not seem to understand that if those elements were applied today, the entire system would virtually collapse. Can improvement be made? It can, but only to a certain degree. But the flawed root problem logic is still there. And if there's anything you walk away with in this talk, it's this flawed root problem recognition. And that's, until this is addressed, it's all just playing the game in a little box. Number two, war. What is war? Across the board, the motivations for war have always been resources and protection of resources at the core, and securing commerce. You can take the propaganda used for centuries regarding liberty and freedom and democracy and safety, and even religious evangelism, such as they blamed the Crusades and everything else. Those really were all fronts, for the most part, for the protection and acquisition of resources from one government or tribe over another. Until you change the way the economic system works and create a globally accepted system of sharing, which is non-competitive at its basic logic, war isn't going anywhere. It is much likely going to get much worse as we approach food scarcity now, energy scarcity, and water scarcity. Very core issues of our survival and standard of living, excuse me. And these are all on the horizons, and not one government is making any true active initiative to assist in the resolution of any of these growing problems. And not to mention the state of technology we have at our hands, which are being quickly absorbed first by the military establishments across the world. If there isn't anything more terrifying than that, I don't know what is. In the words of Albert Einstein, it has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. What is going to happen when the superpowers develop destructive technology that makes the atom bomb look like a Roman catapult? It's right around the corner. Go to Google and type in nanotech weapons. And be amazed at the possibility of creating thermonuclear explosions from a golf ball to an effect where the type of efficiency, when we talk about terrorism, imagine people that really do have the ability to assemble atoms in their basement. If their value systems have not been adapted to something sustainable, we have a very serious problem ahead as our technology begins to clash with these foundational, outdated values that are no longer relevant and impede our survival. At least back in the day, sticks and stones didn't just destroy the whole planet. So we could have outdated values and these competitive notions, but we can't anymore if we expect to survive. It's too much at risk. Paraphrase Carl Sagan, one of my favorite authors, it's almost as though there is a God. And he hands us these technologies and says, here you go, you can either use this to better your lives or destroy yourselves. It's one of my favorite quotes. And while efforts seem to be made to stop, nuclear arms across the world and the like, again, it does not address the real psychological or structural issue. How would we think about a situation if Microsoft needed some Intel chips, but Intel for some reason didn't want to give them up? So Microsoft hires an army, and they go and they knock down the walls of the corporation Intel and steal their chips by force. That would be a bit much to our sense of psychology, wouldn't it? Well, that is precisely in principle what all modern wars represent. It's the ultimate market competition, only an extension in a matter of degree. Put in the context of the competitive market economy and what it represents, it's basically the exact same train of thought. At the end of the day, there's only one human species, there's only one shared set of basic human values. We all have the same basic, if there's anything you call human nature, it's the fact that we have certain needs. And those needs are nearly empirical. Food, air, water. If people aren't touched as a child, they will die. We have an intrinsic social issue. You can take a baby, feed them, give them shelter and clothing, but if you don't touch them, if they don't get any physical contact from some other human, they will die. That's built into the mechanism of our social element that defines our nature. If you want to call something human nature, it's our needs. And our needs are fundamentally shared by all of us. We share these needs, and we inhabit one planet that provides for those needs across the board. Therefore, there really can only be one economy, right? How could you possibly rationalize it otherwise, except with the surface association of tribal warfare, which is based on an old notion that somehow we just magically can never get along. Well, either our interests as a society become unified, or we will destroy ourselves for many different reasons. So you have to ask yourself the question, if someone else is a threat to you, how do you justify your warfare when you know in the larger logic that if you don't learn to work together, you're all going to die? And this is the type of train of thought that I hope can get out there. And it comes from many different angles. There's only one economy, therefore there's only one society. And if you open that up, as attacked as I might be, called, well, I don't know, a communist, New World Order, theosophist, I've been called everything under the sun because of the simple advocation that, hey, maybe we should all work together. I read a book recently, or it's actually an old book I had in reference by a man named Epperson. I almost included it in this, but he does an analysis of John Lennon's Imagine. It was an incredible study of projection. And imagine, all the people sharing the world as one. Institution of the New World Order. He interpreted the entire lyric of John Lennon's Imagine as this communist, Marxist advocation of basically leading to global depopulation, if you will. And this is how the train of thoughts of some people like this work. And it's scary to see people think that way, going back to the very first thing I talked about. But that's for another tangent. But I hope that's logical enough and you can see the fundamental reality of that. Number 3, public health. For the sake of this presentation, I want to reduce public health into 2 broad measures, physical and mental. As far as physical health, have you ever noticed that you have to go out of your way and at increased expense to buy food that isn't poisoned with additives and hormones and preservatives and grotesque levels of fat and sugar? It's almost like the idea of good health is held in contempt by industry. You ever notice that? I'm always amused when I go to the store and I see words like green and natural or organic, as though there ever should have been anything else. As though like, oh, a little less poisonous, somewhat more poisonous. And it's just hilarious that we've come to rationalize these things, and normal food is really the worst food. I've even seen that, like, oh, apparently, you know, some reporter, like, organic food doesn't seem to be that much better than normal food. Do they even know what organic means? Cancer deaths have nothing but increased across the world. While more people and, you know, the community activist culture are demanding for chemical agents testing and, you know, more natural production methods and the like, again, most activists are not really complaining about the fact that the market system, in its interest to get more for less, back to cost efficiency, to increase profits, is the incentive source of nearly all public health issues in this regard. It's built-in deprivation. I could go off on massive tangents on this one, such as how, I don't know, industry many years ago very knowingly got people to get addicted to cigarettes so they could have repeat purchasers. It's all common knowledge to all of us, but I think we forget